Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the significance of the Supreme Court ruling in the sedition case against journalist Vinod Dua. We also take a quick look at different states beginning the process of unlocking. But first, we talk about the Covovax vaccine. India has now placed an advance order to block 300 million doses of a new COVID-19 vaccine called Covovax. The government said that it is making an advance payment of 1,500 crore rupees to its manufacturer, Biological E, which is based in Hyderabad. This is actually the first time that the central government has placed an order with a vaccine manufacturer before the product has received an emergency use authorization by the Indian regulator. In this segment, Prabha Raghavan, who reports on pharma for the Indian Express, joins us to talk about Covovax, how it works, and why India has now chosen to place an advance order for it. So, Prabha, could you first explain exactly how Covovax works?
Covovax is Biological E's recombinant protein subunit vaccine against COVID-19. A recombinant protein subunit vaccine basically is a vaccine that is made up of a specific part of a virus. In this case, since we're looking at COVID-19, the specific part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that would be looked at is the spike protein, that the spiky surface that we see on the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so we have basically a vaccine that takes just the spike protein of the virus, and you're injected with a certain dosage of the spike protein, which allows your body to build immunity against the SARS-CoV-2 virus, because it is the spike protein that allows the virus to enter your cells in the first place and cause disease and death. So if you are building some level of protection against the outer spikes, the spike protein, you're in effect bringing down the ability of the virus to actually penetrate your cells and actually cause the infection.
Okay, so what Covovax is trying to do, like you said, is introduce this spike protein into our body. And the idea is that this is what is going to generate immunity. And it seems like at some level, all COVID-19 vaccines are trying to introduce something of the virus, either its part or its code into the body, so that the body recognizes it and is able to build immunity and defend itself. So just to illustrate how Covovax is different, could you explain how other COVID-19 vaccines are trying to do this?
Sure. So when we look at other COVID-19 vaccines that are in the market currently, barring vaccines like Covaxin, which is an inactivated vaccine, most of the other vaccines are also targeting the spike protein. These vaccines, viral vector vaccines and mRNA vaccines mostly, how they work, like you said earlier, was they sort of send a code to the cells that allows the cells to get instructions on how to make the spike protein inside your body. What Covovax does is it sort of cuts out that extra work for your body to first create the spike protein. What it does is it gives you the spike protein because it's already extracted the instructions on how to make the spike protein, the genetic sequence of it, and it's basically genetically engineered and cloned the spike protein and has replicated it. It's basically grown just the spike protein in yeast so that it makes several copies of just the spike protein. Then they purify it and they take a certain amount that they think would allow your body to generate an immune response. And then they inject you with just that specific amount of the spike protein. So other vaccines, just to recap, other vaccines are basically sending the instructions to your body to make the spike protein inside your body. So first, our cells will make the spike protein, then our body will recognize it as a threat and generate immune responses against it. Whereas Covovax is giving you the spike protein to start with. So your body can sort of jump into action against this foreign object.
Okay, so now when we talk about Covovax, we know that it is being indigenously produced by Biological E, which is headquartered in Hyderabad. This is a company that makes many other vaccines as well, and it claims to be the largest producer of the tetanus vaccine in the world. Now, while that is the case, you also write that the origins of Covovax can be traced back to the Baylor College of Medicine in the US. Could you talk about those origins and how the vaccine was developed?
So the Baylor College of Medicine has this school called the National School of Tropical Medicine in Houston, Texas. And this college, this National School of Tropical Medicine, has been working on making recombinant protein vaccines for other coronaviruses for a decade at least. So they got previous experience working on vaccines for SARS and MERS using the exact same technology, the recombinant protein technology. And this isn't a very path-breaking new technology. It's been used for decades for other viruses as well. And in fact, one of the vaccines that people get against hepatitis B, that is made using this platform of recombinant protein. And so this school, Baylor College of Medicine, said, okay, well, we already have our learnings from working on other coronaviruses. We know all the techniques that are required to make a recombinant protein vaccine for coronaviruses. And we know how to make sure that they're more effective and are at a high quality. So the minute that the genetic sequence, the makeup of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was made available last year in January or February, researchers at the National School of Tropical Medicine took that sequence, looked at, what part of the sequence is the gene of the spike protein, and just took out that specific sequence, worked on cloning it, and engineered it in their own labs so that they could then make copies of just the spike protein.
And when we talk about just how this vaccine is produced, Prabha says that its process is actually very similar to that of beer. She explains that once the scientists at the Baylor College had the gene of the spike protein, they inserted that into yeast. And yeast is what helped replicate and grow the spike protein.
And that's kind of how beer is also made. It's fermented in yeast, and then it releases the beer. In this case, it's releasing the recombinant protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus.
And she says that after the scientists at the Baylor College were able to purify the recombinant protein that was produced in the yeast, and they added substances that would enhance the immune response in the body and figured out what raw materials would be required, they put all that information together and approached the vaccine manufacturer Biological E. This happened last August.
And so last August, we saw one of the agreements that Biological E announced was with the Baylor College of Medicine. And this is that vaccine. Corbevax is the vaccine that Biological E had tied up with Baylor College of Medicine to take forward in testing. And so while most of the clinical trials of this vaccine have been conducted in India, while a lot of the preclinical testing, the animal testing, and the data generated for this vaccine on its safety and its ability to prompt an immune response has been generated in India, the initial work, the concept work, and just the initial candidates development was first done in Houston by the Baylor College of Medicine.
And Prabha, right now, what do we know about how efficacious this vaccine is against COVID-19?
So, unfortunately, right now, we don't really know much about the efficacy of this vaccine. This is because the phase 3 clinical trials, which actually capture this information on the efficacy, they haven't really reached a stage where we can get that information. In fact, right now, I tried looking up information on where the clinical trials are taking place in the phase 3 segment of the testing in India, and I didn't see any entry on the clinical trial registry of India, which is where usually most of the companies reveal where they're actually testing their vaccines in, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. So right now, we don't really have much clarity on whether the phase 3 trials have started yet, and if they have, how many people have been vaccinated, in which clinical trial sites. And we don't know how much data has actually been collected on the efficacy as a result of this. The approvals for conducting these clinical trials came over a month ago. So the sense is that the testing should be underway, but at the same time, there has been no announcement by even the company. There has been no clarity by the company or others involved in the testing of this vaccine as to what stage the phase 3 trials are actually at. And without the phase 3 trials even starting, we won't really get clarity on the efficacy of a vaccine like this.
Okay, so considering that is the case, what gives us confidence that it will eventually be efficacious?
So, given that this is a tried and tested platform that has shown decent amount of efficacy against other viruses like hepatitis B, there is hope that Corbavax 2 may also be able to show a similar sort of effectiveness in a large population when this vaccine is used. Another thing that can potentially be used as a reference at the moment while we wait for actual data from the company on the efficacy is the efficacy information that we've seen from trials of Novavax, which is another protein-based vaccine. So it also follows a similar process in the way the vaccine is created and the way it's supposed to develop an immune response. And what we have seen from interim information on the efficacy of the Novavax vaccine is that it provides pretty good protection against the virus, against severe symptomatic disease and death. So that's one thing that we can hope to also see in coming out of the trials of Corbavax.
And Prabha, one thing we know is that this vaccine is supposed to be a lot cheaper than the other vaccines currently available in the market. Why is that?
The answer to this question really goes back to the fact that this is an old technique for making vaccines. Companies like Biological E have mass produced or have the capacity to make about 1 billion doses of hepatitis B vaccines, for instance. And the technology that Corbavax uses is the same as the technology that the hepatitis B vaccines use. And so it's easy for a company like Biological E to scale up production of a vaccine like Corbavax using its existing manufacturing lines for its hepatitis B vaccine. And it's also going to be much cheaper because it costs much less in terms of the ingredients, the yeast, the alum that is used as part of the adjuvant, and other particles or other raw materials that are used in the production process are things that a company like Biological E already has in its cabinet to make a vaccine like this. And so the cost of production is much lower. You don't really have to set up a new advanced facility. It's not a new technology that's being used. It's not very time consuming. It's easy to scale up. And given that the cost of making, say, a hepatitis B vaccine is less than $1 or $2, it's expected, at least the Baylor College of Medicine expects, that Biological E will be able to make Corbavax at roughly the same price.
Now, one thing that we had mentioned in the beginning was that this vaccine has not received emergency use authorization. But despite that, India has placed advance orders for it. This is something that it didn't do with Covaxin or Covishield or Sputnik V. For these vaccines, it only placed orders when they received approvals. But this was a problem. Prabha says that this is a big reason why India has witnessed an acute vaccine shortage. Like during the second wave, when cases surged and a lot more people wanted to get vaccinated, there weren't enough vaccines. This is because India had not placed orders in advance to the vaccine manufacturers. So these companies could not build up the supply that was required. She says that many other countries, like the UK and the US, had taken that risk. They had placed advance orders even though the vaccines had not received emergency authorization, and so they didn't know how efficacious they would turn out to be. Many even invested in the development of the vaccines, which India is now doing with Covovax.
So, constrained supply, lack of prior orders, advance orders, or lack of at-risk investment was one of possibly the major learnings that India had from its experience in the second wave. And so, in order to not really repeat that kind of a mistake, it's only sensible that, given the fact that the government wants about 2 billion doses of vaccines by December, it will start stockpiling. It will start placing orders in advance. It will start investing at risk in companies that haven't even received emergency approvals. It's because most of the other countries had placed advanced orders for these vaccines and had booked out the supply that was available. So we heard last month that the Indian government was just saying that, well, we're still in negotiations with Pfizer and Moderna, but their order books are already full because of advance orders. Now, Pfizer has come out and said, yeah, we have a limited supply, and, there have been reports of the fact that Pfizer is potentially looking at providing 50 million doses of its vaccine to India, but that's a very small amount that it's going to be able to spare for the Indian population. Given the fact that our population is so large and that less than, say, 5% of our population has actually been vaccinated, you need to have a sufficient stockpile of vaccines.
And next we talk about the ruling in the sedition case against Vinod Dua. Last week, the Supreme Court quashed a sedition case which was filed against well-known TV anchor and journalist Vinod Dua. The case of sedition was filed against Dua by a local BJP leader in Himachal Pradesh over his YouTube show, in which he had made remarks against Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the government's handling of the migrant crisis during the COVID-19 lockdown last year. Now, the sedition law, which was first introduced during the British Raj, is often misused to curb dissent and suppress voices against the government. In fact, during the colonial era, it was used against Mahatma Gandhi and Bal Gangadhar Tilak for this very reason. Though in the past, the Supreme Court has upheld the constitutional validity of the sedition law. This happened in the famous Kedarnath Singh versus Union of India case. But in this landmark case, the court also tried to limit the scope for its misuse. So while quashing Vinod Dua's case, the court once again reiterated the principles that were laid out in the Kedarnath Singh versus Union of India case. In this segment, Apurva Vishwanath, who reports on law for the newspaper, joins us to talk about the case and its significance. So, Apurva, could you first talk about exactly what was the case against Vinod Dua?
So, there was a YouTube video in which Vinod Dua had criticized Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the central government's handling of the migrant crisis last year. In the video, Dua says that Modi would be directly responsible for the large-scale migration that we saw last year, where thousands of people walked to their hometowns. So that particular video is the basis of this case against Vinod Dua. A local BJP leader called Ajay Sham filed a case of sedition against Dua. So apart from Section 124A of the IPC, which is sedition, there were cases under the Disaster Management Act that was filed against Dua. In cases of sedition, the state government essentially has to give a sanction to initiate prosecution in these cases. So here, the state government started investigating the case, and also there was an imminent threat of arrest for Vinod Dua. So at this point, Dua approached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court provided interim protection to him from arrest. And in the meanwhile, Dua also challenged the filing of the FIR itself, the FIR that BJP leader Ajay Sham had filed. So the court was looking into a petition of quashing the FIR against Vinod Dua. And also Vinod Dua made another prayer that when cases of sedition are filed against journalists, that there be some sort of pre-screening before they are actually investigated seriously. Because we have seen the frivolous use of sedition and use of sedition as a tool against dissent in the past. So Dua's prayer was essentially to have this extra layer of protection, especially for journalists.
And could you talk about what this extra layer, this extra protection specifically asked for?
So what Dua asked was that a direction from the court that when an FIR against a journalist is filed who has at least, say, 10 years of standing, such cases should not be registered unless it is cleared by a committee which would be constituted by the state governments themselves. But the committee would comprise, say, a Chief Justice of the High Court or a judge designated by him, the leader of opposition, and people like that. So it's basically that there is seriousness or there is weight in the complaint that is filed against a journalist, and not every frivolous or even in the case of Dua, a politically motivated case be taken up by the state police.
Okay, so now we understand that the court, when looking at the case, decided that his remarks that he made in that YouTube video were in fact genuine criticism of the government. And the court decided that those comments cannot be labeled seditious. And while doing so, the court reiterated the principles that were laid out in the Kedarnath Singh versus Union of India case. And this, of course, was this landmark case on sedition. Could you talk about this case and what it said about sedition?
So we're talking about a 1962 verdict of the Supreme Court in which the court essentially upheld the sedition law, but it also put in place a lot of restrictions on the state as to when this law of sedition can be applied. And these principles have still sort of been the good law on sedition. And cases, it is one of those cases which tells the state that you cannot use sedition when there is criticism of the government. So in that judgment, the court basically explains Section 124A and tells the governments what its meaning is. So, for example, the expression that is used in Section 124A, it says, whoever by words, either written or spoken, or by signs or visible representation, brings or attempts to bring hatred or contempt towards the government established by law. So, this phrase towards government established by law often is interpreted as a party in power, a party which has formed the government. But the court in Kedarnath Singh very crucially clarified that the expression government established by law is not persons who are leaders at that point of time. It has to be distinguished from the persons for the time being engaged in carrying on the administration. So government established by law is the state, India itself, and not a government which is transient and changes every 5 years. So this is one of the major clarifications that the Kedarnath Singh ruling provides us. And it also says any act which can be labeled seditious under Section 124A will have to necessarily import the idea of violence or public disorder. So it could either be a call for violence or an attempt to commit actual violence. Only when it is accompanied by a call for violence is when you can term something seditious. So mere words like sloganeering in that case would not constitute sedition. We've had a lot of judgments in which Khalistani sloganeers, when they say something against India, that itself will not constitute sedition, but that has to be accompanied by actual violence. So in Dua's case, it was not accompanied by violence. Dua did not incite violence, nor did he call for violence. So the court actually goes into the situation that was prevailing in the country on March 30th last year and says there was a genuine need for criticism, or that was a prevailing ground situation, and as a journalist, Dua is entitled to criticize the government.
Okay, so the court deciding that what Dua said was genuine criticism of the government is one thing, but what did the court decide on the other extra layer of protection that Dua had asked for?
So the other prayer that Dua had sought, that the Supreme Court did not accept, because the court says if we are pre-screening committees against senior journalists, that would essentially be the court entering what is legislative domain. The law, Section 124A itself, does not require any such screening, or the screening that is required is by the state government itself. Because, like, for example, in a case of murder or any other IPC crime, you don't need sanction from the government to initiate prosecution. But there are certain specific class of crimes for which you do need that sanction. Sedition is one of them. So when there is a layer of protection, journalists as a category may not necessarily need another layer of protection, is what the court says. But the court, while it says that, the principles of Kedarnath still apply, and that is enough to protect not just journalists, but every citizen of the country.
Now, the Supreme Court reiterating these principles and also ruling that what Vinod Dua said was just criticism, what kind of significance does it have, and in what way can we see it impacting other cases?
So the verdict in Vinod Dua's case is just one example of the sedition law being misused by, state agencies. But there are hundreds of cases that continue to be filed against activists, protesters, to muzzle dissent in the country. But why this is important, why the court's reiteration of the Kedarnath principles is important, because just last week, before this verdict came out, Justice Chandrachud also in court made these observations that the Andhra Pradesh government had misused the sedition law in applying it to two media houses in the state. In another case, just on the same day, he made a very sarcastic remark asking if the government plans to file a case of sedition against news channels which are showing bodies of COVID victims in the river Ganga. So the court is aware of the misuse of sedition law. And then in a verdict, the court saying it in as many words. All of this just gives credence to a new challenge that we have before the Supreme Court. In 1962, they upheld it in the Kedarnath ruling. But now there is a fresh challenge against sedition law. So we are going to have judicial conversation against about whether we have to keep the sedition law or whether it's time for this colonial law to be declared unconstitutional. So all of these things, when you look at it together, the remarks in court and this ruling itself, it adds a lot of significance and weight to the legal challenge that is already pending in court.
So a larger bench of the Supreme Court eventually looking at scrapping the sedition law altogether is one thing, but until that happens, the law being misused will, I suppose, continue to remain a problem. And we have seen sedition cases even rise in the past few years. So where do you think the problem lies when it comes to this?
So, till the time the Supreme Court declares it unconstitutional, sedition law continues to be on the books. It can be used very easily for, like we talked about, quelling dissent in the country. But a journalist whose credentials are as good as Vinod Dua's can go to the Supreme Court and get the FIRs against him quashed. But there are a lot of journalists and ordinary citizens who may not have those resources or whose cases are lost in that big pile of pending cases in high courts across the country. One thing that a judgment like this from the Supreme Court does is send a message to high courts and lower courts to look at these sedition cases more closely, to ask more questions of the state. We have seen trial courts where the judge has to take cognizance of the offense, sometimes not asking serious questions of the state. Last year, we had a report in our newspaper where a series of sedition cases filed during the protests against citizenship law, where district judges did not ask the state any questions as to how something constitutes sedition or not. But a message like this from the Supreme Court goes a long way in addressing that. But till such time the law continues to be on books, it is open for misuse.
And in the end, we take a quick look at states easing lockdown restrictions. On Sunday, India had recorded over 1.14 lakh new COVID-19 cases. This was the lowest spike of daily cases in 2 months. And considering that daily infections have been going down, some states across the country have started the process of unlocking by gradually easing COVID-19 induced restrictions and curfews. From Delhi to Tamil Nadu, several states have announced plans to relax lockdowns based on their weekly positive rates and the occupancy of oxygen beds in hospitals. Delhi, for example, has now allowed shops inside malls, markets, and market complexes to be open between 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. on an odd-even basis. And Delhi's metro will now be permitted to operate at 50% seating capacity. In Maharashtra, the government has announced a 5-level unlock plan based on the positivity rate and occupancy of oxygenated beds in each district. Under this plan, districts falling under level 1 will have least restrictions. So for them, malls, theatres, shops, gyms and restaurants can resume normal operations, while those in level 5 will have lockdown-like curbs. Meanwhile, there are also some states like Karnataka, Himachal Pradesh and Goa that have decided to continue with lockdowns considering their own COVID-19 situations. You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.